Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I was walking home along the main avenue that cut through the city. The sidewalks slick with rain, the streetlights reflecting in long, trembling lines on the asphalt. It was late, later than I usually stayed out, and the streets were quiet, except for the occasional passing car, its tires hissing through shallow puddles. I had my headphones in, the soft hum of ambient music keeping my mind occupied, when I noticed a billboard up ahead, a massive digital screen that usually displayed harmless ads, flashing with bold colors and smiling faces. At first it seemed ordinary, until I blinked. Just a brief, unconscious blink. The ad had changed. The bright smile of the commercial was gone, replaced by an image that made my stomach twist. It was a scene I had never seen on any ad before. A dark alleyway, eerily familiar, but distorted, impossible. And in the corner of the image, I recognized something I shouldn't have: my own hands, trembling as they gripped the edge of the frame. I stopped walking, my heart beating faster, blinking again to shake off the sudden unease. But when I opened my eyes, the billboard had shifted again. The next image was of a small, dimly lit room that I had dreamed about years ago, a dream I had buried deep in memory. On the screen, I saw myself standing in that room, alone, looking around with the same confusion I had felt in the dream. My blood ran cold. I blinked again. It changed. Now it showed a street I knew well, except there were shadows moving where there should have been none, and a figure at the far end of the street that resembled me but wrong, twisted, with eyes too dark, a grin too sharp. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was some glitch in the digital display, a clever ad campaign designed to shock people. But the images didn't seem random. Each blink revealed something I feared most: failure, isolation, mistakes. I had never admitted to anyone. With every fleeting closure of my eyes, the billboard seemed to read deeper into me, plucking private terrors I had never spoken aloud. I slowed my pace, unable to pull my gaze away entirely, though every fiber of my being screamed to look down, to pretend it wasn't happening. The rain was heavier now, a thin curtain across the street. Yet the billboard shone vividly through the mist, each image impossibly clear. I blinked again and saw my own face, but older, hollowed, with eyes wide and terrified, and beneath it, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into my mind, a single word appeared: alone. I felt the air thicken around me, my breath coming faster, shallow. The world seemed to warp. Streetlights flickered, cars slowed to a crawl, and distant echoes of laughter war crying I couldn't tell rippled through the wet city. Every blink now was a gamble. Each time my eyes closed, I felt the billboard studying me, rearranging itself to reveal yet another fear I hadn't even realized I carried. A life wasted, a friendship lost, the quiet betrayal of someone I loved. I tried to cover my eyes, pressing my palms against them, but when I opened them slightly, just a sliver, the images came back more precise, more intimate. My apartment, my family, my friends, things that should have felt safe were twisted into nightmare versions of themselves. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft hum of the digital screen, a pulse like a heartbeat, syncing with my own. Panic clawed at me, yet I couldn't look away. Step by step, I moved forward, each motion sluggish. the world distorted as if gravity itself was bending around the billboard's light. I thought of running, of turning down a side street. But every alley I glanced at reflected my own fears in subtle, impossible ways. The city had become a mirror of dread, each blink another revelation. Finally, I reached my own street, the familiar row of buildings offering a small comfort. I thought, maybe, just maybe, the nightmare would end once I stepped inside my apartment. I glanced back at the billboard one last time, but the image that greeted me froze me in place. There, on the digital screen, I was standing exactly where I was at that moment, staring back with wide, terrified eyes. And above me, in faint, flickering letters, a single sentence. "We'll see what you see next." I hurried home, locking every door and window, yet sleep did not come that night. And even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I swear I can feel the billboard's gaze through my eyelids, waiting for the next blink, ready to show me the fears I've tried so desperately to forget. It was late, the city draped in the soft glow of streetlights reflected in slick tram rails, the rain having slowed to a fine mist. I had boarded the tram at the usual stop, expecting the usual quiet ride home. The carriage was almost empty, save for a few scattered passengers, heads bent over phones, or staring out at the blurred streets. The hum of the tram and the faint rhythm of raindrops against the windows created a gentle, lulling backdrop, and I sank into my seat, letting the warmth of the heater seep into my damp coat. I noticed her almost immediately, though I told myself I must be mistaken. She was sitting in the seat beside me, a young woman with long dark hair, wearing a pale coat that seemed to shimmer slightly under the fluorescent lights I had not seen. Her bored, and yet there she was, perfectly composed, her gaze fixed somewhere far away, unfocused yet impossible to ignore. I glanced around, and the rest of the tram felt ordinary, mundane, but something about her made the air denser, heavier, charged with a quiet intensity. I looked down, and that's when it struck me her feet. They didn't touch the floor, not slightly, not on tiptoe, not even brushing the edge of the seat in front. She hovered, suspended inches above the cold tram flooring, a calm, effortless levitation that defied reason. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that perhaps the reflection of the tram lights or the angle of my vision had tricked me. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. She wasn't standing, she wasn't sitting, she simply existed, suspended, a soft, quiet impossibility. I felt a shiver creep along my spine. The tram lurched gently, the wheels clattering against the tracks, and her presence seemed to ripple with it, moving with a grace that was almost liquid. The air between us carried a faint warmth, a sensation that was intimate yet utterly alien. I wanted to move, to get up and sit elsewhere, but my body felt heavy, rooted to the seat as though some invisible tether held me in place. I studied her face, the soft curve of her jaw, the distant melancholy in her eyes, and I realized she was looking at me. Not directly, not with hostility, but with a curious intensity, as if she knew the private corners of my mind. Every small movement I made, every subtle twitch, she seemed to notice. I could feel the hum of her presence like a vibration against my own pulse. Gentle but insistent, a quiet insistence that I should not look away. Time stretched, the tram moving in its familiar path, yet it felt slower, warped. Shadows flickered along the walls, elongated by passing streetlights, and each time my gaze shifted, I thought she moved slightly closer, though her levitation remained perfect, her feet never brushing the floor. The other passengers were oblivious, absorbed in their own worlds, but I could not tear my eyes away. I was acutely aware of every sound, the soft hum of the tram, the faint drip of water from the windows, the brushing whisper of her coat against the air, and every sensation was magnified in the presence of her impossible calm. I felt a warmth against my arm and looked instinctively, only to see nothing. No hand, no brush, no movement, but an undeniable pressure, subtle and gentle, as though she had touched me without touching me at all. My breath caught, my mind racing with questions I dared not voice. How was this possible? Why was she here? And most importantly, why had she chosen me to sit beside? The tram slowed at my stop, the doors sliding open with a mechanical sigh. I stood quickly, eager to escape the hypnotic gravity of her gaze, and yet, when I turned back, she was gone. Not simply standing up, not stepping away, not fading into the shadows. She had vanished entirely, leaving only the faint trace of cold air where her presence had been. The tram felt impossibly empty now, ordinary again, yet I knew it had not been ordinary at all. I walked home in the mist, the wet streets reflecting the city lights like pools of liquid silver. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her hovering somewhere in the distance, silently observing, perfectly still, yet impossibly present. At home, I checked the seat again, the floor, the space beside me, and there was nothing, no sign, no trace, nothing to confirm what I had seen. And yet, I can still feel her presence, a quiet, hovering awareness that sometimes brushes against the edges of my thoughts, as if she never truly left, as if the next time I board a tram, she will be there again, suspended beside me, watching, waiting, her impossible feet never touching the floor. I was walking home late one evening, the city streets wet from a lingering drizzle, the sidewalks reflecting the muted glow of streetlights in pools of yellow and silver. The air smelled faintly of rain and asphalt, a scent I usually found comforting, like a quiet promise of normalcy. Most of the city had gone to sleep, leaving only the occasional car gliding silently along the empty streets. I liked these hours, the stillness made it feel like I owned the world. A strange solitude that was both calming and slightly lonely. I rounded a corner onto a side street I thought I knew well, and there, under the halo of a flickering lamp, a street performer stood. He had a guitar slung over his shoulder, an old, worn instrument that seemed as tired as the man himself. I had passed him countless times before, never noticing him in particular, but tonight something made me pause. He began to play a song. It was soft, the notes gentle, almost hypnotic. I thought at first it was some random melody, familiar but strange. Then, slowly, words emerged from his voice, words that made me stop in my tracks. He was singing about me, not in some abstract, vague way, but with unnerving specificity. The way I walked, the small rituals I performed in the morning, the conversations I had with no one around, the exact thoughts I had been carrying all week. I froze, the drizzle soaking through my coat unnoticed. Each line of the song was a mirror to my life, a map of intimate moments I had never shared with anyone. He described my childhood memories, the faces of people long gone, and even the mistakes I had tried to bury in silence. My throat tightened, and my hands shook as I realized no one else was on the street. Not a passerby, not a stray cat, not even the wind to carry a sound like that. And yet, he knew everything. I tried to turn away, to walk past him, but my feet wouldn't obey. The melody wove around me, wrapping the street in a thick, invisible web, pulling me closer despite my resistance. Every note was deliberate, every word precise. I could feel a strange vibration in the air, a resonance that seemed to reach into my chest, stirring memories I hadn't touched in years. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he knew, but my voice died in my throat. The song shifted then, becoming darker, slower. He sang of things I hadn't even remembered myself, secrets I had thought were locked away, names of people I had loved and lost, places I had once visited in dreams and never spoken of. It was as though he was digging into my life in real time, narrating my story to an audience that did not exist. The rain fell heavier now, mixing with the cold sweat that ran down my spine. The world around me dissolving into the sound of the song and the dim, flickering light of the street lamp. I glanced around, desperate for some sign of another living soul, some reassurance that this was real and not a hallucination. But the street was empty, silent except for the music. I felt a presence then, a subtle shift in the air behind me, like a shadow brushing past my shoulder. I wanted to run, yet something fear, curiosity, inevitability, kept me rooted to the spot. The song ended as abruptly as it had begun, the last note hanging in the air like smoke, fading slowly into silence. I stared at the performer, but he was gone, not walking away, not slipping into the shadows, simply gone. The street was empty, the rain dripping steadily, and the faint glow of the street lamp flickered as if nothing had happened at all. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and rain-soaked streets. But in the days that followed, I began to notice small things, lines of the song repeating in my head, memories I had never thought to revisit, shadows at the corner of my vision that moved just slightly too deliberately. And sometimes, in the quiet of night, I swear I hear a guitar, soft and deliberate, playing a song that knows everything about me, waiting patiently on a street I will pass again. Even now, I avoid that corner whenever I can, but I cannot erase the certainty that if I return, the street performer will be there, and he will sing. And this time, perhaps, the song will not end. It had been raining all evening, a soft, steady drizzle that turned the streets into rivers of silver under the streetlights. I had returned home later than usual, my coat soaked through, my shoes leaving dark prints across the wooden floor of my apartment. Steam curled from the kettle I set on the stove, filling the small kitchen with a warm haze, and I leaned back against the counter, letting the quiet settle over me. It was one of those nights when the city outside felt distant, muffled by the curtain of rain and fog, and I thought I would spend the evening alone with a cup of tea, letting the sound of water hitting the windows lull me into calm. I was washing my hands at the sink when I noticed the bathroom mirror fogging up from the steam, and for a moment I smiled at the familiar sight. I traced a finger along the condensation, drawing a sloppy heart and chuckling to myself, enjoying the simple, childish comfort of it. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw it, my name, written clearly on the window above the sink, letters carefully formed, dripping slightly with moisture. I froze, my hands trembling as I turned toward the window. My name stared back at me in the mist, neat, precise, and undeniably real. I knew I had not written it. I had not been near the window, hadn't touched it since I walked in. The bathroom was silent except for the soft hiss of the kettle and the rain tapping against the glass. My pulse spiked. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the edges of the glass as I tried to touch the letters, to confirm they were just condensation, a trick of the steam. But they didn't smear, didn't dissolve under my fingers. My name remained, written from the inside, as if someone had been there, watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, my mind racing through explanations. Maybe it was a prank. But the apartment had been empty all day. I was sure of it. My neighbors were nowhere near, and the building's hallway was silent. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was exhaustion, my imagination painting letters where there were none. Yet, deep down, I could feel the weight of being watched, a subtle pressure pressing against the back of my neck. I moved to the living room, trying to shake off the unease, telling myself I would check again later. The rain outside was relentless, drumming on the roof in an even, hypnotic rhythm. I poured the tea, its warmth doing little to calm the icy crawl down my spine. The apartment felt smaller, every shadow stretching just a little longer than it should. Every flicker of light from passing cars outside casting strange, distorted shapes across the walls. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was impossible to tell. I forced myself to return to the bathroom, cautiously peering around the corner. The window was still fogged, but now a new message had appeared beneath my name. A single word, simple, but impossibly wrong, inside. My breath caught. I could feel it, though I knew it was absurd, the sense of presence, close and patient, observing me from somewhere unseen. I fled to the bedroom, locking the door, pulling the blanket tightly around myself. The rain continued its steady hymn outside, but inside, I could hear something subtle, soft, deliberate movements that didn't belong to me, a faint tapping on the wooden floor, perhaps the slow brush of fingertips against glass. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the apartment's old pipes or the wind were causing tricks in my mind, but the sinking certainty that I was not alone wouldn't leave me. Hours passed, and I could not sleep. I kept glancing toward the bathroom window, every shadow and flicker of light seeming to whisper my name. The air itself felt thicker, heavier, as though something unseen leaned against the walls, listening. And then, just as my eyelids began to droop, I saw it again, my name, freshly written in the fog, accompanied by a second line I hadn't noticed before: "Don't turn around." I froze, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape. I wanted to laugh, to call it a prank, but the quiet weight of the apartment told me otherwise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt a cold brush against my shoulder, soft, deliberate, patient. I did not move, did not breathe, frozen in place, as the rain tapped against the window, the steam curling upward, and my name remained written on the glass from the inside. Even now, I cannot forget the way it felt, the impossible certainty, that someone, or something, had been there, inside my apartment, inside my world, writing my name in the fog, waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I imagine the letters forming again, the single word beneath it, and the soft, patient brush against my shoulder, reminding me that perhaps it never left at all. I had always found comfort in the quiet corners of the city, the places that felt untouched by the constant rush of traffic and human activity. That evening, the streets were unusually empty. The sky was bruised with dark clouds, and a soft, persistent drizzle had begun, wetting the cobblestones and reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. The city square, which on most evenings buzzed with chatter and movement, was silent. A few stray leaves drifted across the pavement, carried by a thin wind, and the sound of water dripping from the eaves of nearby buildings was the only thing keeping me company. I had come to this square for solace, a brief pause in the monotony of life, and I walked slowly, deliberately, letting the damp air press against my skin. I remember reaching the center of the square, where the fountain usually gurgled and splashed, but tonight it was still, the water dark and motionless. I leaned against its edge, listening to the soft hiss of rain on stone, feeling the quiet settle like a heavy blanket. That's when I first heard it, the faintest sound of applause. At first, I thought I had imagined it, the sound of hands clapping faintly echoing in my mind like a memory. I glanced around. The square was empty. There was no cafe open, no performers, no tourists. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, echoing off the old stone buildings. It was measured, polite, almost patient. My pulse quickened, and a strange shiver ran down my spine. I stepped forward, peering into the shadows of the square. The clapping continued, growing ever so slightly louder, but still without source. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello." The sound of my own voice felt alien in the emptiness, swallowed immediately by the rain and the darkness. There was no answer, only the applause, now somewhere ahead of me, then behind, as if it circled around the fountain, keeping pace with my movements. A flickering street lamp drew my gaze to the edges of the square. I saw shadows where there should have been none, long thin shapes that moved independently of the trees and buildings. I strained to see, my breath shallow in the damp night air, but the shadows did not resemble anything human. And yet, the applause persisted, measured, quiet, and infinitely patient. I began to walk, keeping my eyes on the shadows, my ears fixed on the sound. It followed me, sometimes faint, sometimes swelling just a little, like a tide of invisible hands. I noticed subtle things I had never seen before. The fountain's water, dark and still, rippling slightly despite no wind. The distant outlines of doors that I knew were sealed, shifting as if opening just slightly in the darkness. Reflections in puddles that did not mirror my movements but something else, just out of sight. The applause changed as I moved, sometimes slower, almost mocking, sometimes quick and nervous, as if testing me. My heart pounded, each beat echoing like a drum in the empty square. I felt watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by many, all just beyond reach, beyond sight, invisible yet present. I tried to tell myself it was the rain, a trick of the echoes off stone and glass, but even rational thoughts were drowned by the soft, patient clapping that seemed to know my every move. I found myself at the edge of the square, near a narrow alley I had never noticed before. The applause swelled, insistent now, closer, coming from a direction I could not pinpoint. I turned to leave, to retrace my steps, but the streets had shifted. Buildings were not where I remembered. The alley seemed to stretch impossibly long into darkness, and the exit I had walked through countless times was nowhere in sight. The applause became a chorus, layered, overlapping, as though multiple, unseen hands celebrated something I could not understand. I stumbled backward, pressed my palms over my ears, but it did not stop. And then, beneath it, I heard whispers, too soft to discern, brushing against my consciousness, weaving around the claps, almost forming words that dissolved before I could grasp them. I ran then, not caring where I went, each step echoing in the deserted square. The puddles reflected distorted shapes that followed me, shapes that moved independently, stretching toward me, bending in ways the human eye should not perceive. And still, the applause followed, patient, polite, inevitable, growing more distinct with every step, like an audience unseen but fully present. Finally, I reached what I thought was the edge of the square, the familiar street that should have led me home. I looked back once, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw them dozens of figures, only shadows, standing silently around the fountain, clapping. Not a sound breaking the night, except their invisible hands. And then the square was empty again. The rain fell softly, the fountain remained still, and the city around me appeared as it always had, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Even now, when the streets are empty, and the rain taps gently against the windows, I can hear its soft, patient applause in the distance, echoing from corners that should hold no one. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I see shadows shift where they should not, waiting quietly, clapping for someone I do not recognize, or perhaps for me. I remember it as clearly as if it were happening right now. I was sitting on a bench in the small public square near my apartment, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down when the rain fell in thin, steady lines. The world smelled of wet asphalt and old bricks, that faint, sweet mustiness that comes after a day-long drizzle. In my hands, I held a map of the city, folded over and worn at the creases, the kind of map I had carried for years. I had always liked looking at it, tracing streets with my finger, imagining the paths I might take, the hidden corners I had yet to explore. That evening, the rain fell in a soft rhythm, tapping against the umbrella I had abandoned in favor of feeling it drip down my sleeves, and I opened the map again, expecting the usual comfort of familiarity. The first oddity was subtle. I traced a route I knew well, a shortcut I had walked countless times. The streets were all there, familiar lines converging at familiar intersections. But then I noticed something strange. A street that had always ended in a dead end, now curved sharply and continued on the map, leading into areas I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was some updated edition of the map. Perhaps a new construction, new streets added to the city. I squinted through the rain, trying to make sense of the lines and labels. The map felt heavier than usual in my hands, the paper somehow damp and cold despite being inside my coat. I looked up from the map and across the square, trying to find a landmark to ground myself. The fountain, the old bookstore, The row of closed cafes, they were all where they should be. Everything outside seemed ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the city had shifted in subtle ways. I traced the same route on the map again, following my finger along familiar streets, and I saw it change. One by one, alleys appeared. Where I knew there were walls, crosswalks vanished. Buildings that had always had doors now had windows in strange places. I blinked, certain that my eyes were playing tricks on me, or that the rain had blurred the ink. But the lines kept changing, redrawing themselves under my gaze. A low wind whispered through the square, rustling the edges of the map and carrying the faint sound of footsteps that weren't my own. I looked up, but no one was there. The square was empty, except for a stray pigeon shivering in the rain. My heart began to pound, a slow, uneasy rhythm, echoing the irregular patter of rain against the stone bench. I looked back down at the map, and it had changed again. This time, a street I had never seen, narrow and crooked, stretched out from a familiar plaza and wound its way into some unknown district. My finger hovered over it, trembling slightly, as though tracing it might pull me into a new reality. I tried to stand, to leave the square and get home, but something in the air made me hesitate. The familiar streets I had taken hundreds of times seemed just slightly off. Signs were angled differently. A lamppost I passed every evening appeared, where it shouldn't have been. I felt a creeping sense of vertigo, as if the city itself were breathing around me, subtly shifting its shape while I looked at it. The map in my hands reflected it, as if the paper and the streets were connected by some invisible, sinister thread. Minutes or maybe hours passed, though I couldn't tell which. I watched the lines continue to morph, streets looping into themselves, entire blocks disappearing, names I knew turning into cryptic words I didn't recognize. And then I noticed the most disturbing part. On the map, a small figure appeared at the spot where I was sitting. I recognized it immediately. It was me, hunched over, staring down at the paper, drenched by rain. I froze. The figure lifted its head, and, in the faint shadows of the printed lines, I could see the outline of my own face staring back. It mimicked my every movement, almost in real time, yet slightly delayed, always a fraction behind. I wanted to drop the map, to run, to tear the paper in half, but my hands were frozen, gripping it as though compelled. And as I watched, the figure on the map started moving along streets I didn't know, wandering further and further from my bench. The lines of the city seemed to ripple and warp around it, creating impossible angles and loops. I looked up at the real city, but I could not reconcile the map with what I saw. The fountain was still there, but the buildings around it had shifted. Windows I had passed 1,000 times were gone. Doors led to brick walls. Even the rain seemed heavier, closer, as though the sky itself pressed down on me in anticipation. A whisper reached my ears, soft, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable, my name. I spun around, searching, but no one was there. The square remained empty, except for the map in my hands, the figure still moving through streets that only existed on paper. My heart raced, and I realized with a sudden, sinking certainty that the longer I looked at the map, the more the city around me obeyed it, bending in subtle, unnerving ways. Every step I took felt guided, every turn compelled by invisible lines I could not see. Finally, I mustered the courage to fold the map and put it away. I walked home quickly, drenched and trembling. When I arrived, I placed it on my table and stared at it. The lines were still shifting, subtly, almost lazily now, but unmistakably alive. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, exhaustion, or the wet paper warping under the humidity. But the next day, when I ventured out again, I discovered that streets I had walked my entire life had changed. The alleyways, the corners, the buildings, they were not as I remembered, and sometimes, late at night, I still unfold the map. The figure is always there, hunched, staring at me from its paper world, and the streets continue to shift beneath it, endlessly, impossibly. I no longer trust my own memory of the city. I no longer trust the streets I walk every day. And sometimes, when the rain falls soft and persistent, I swear I see the figure moving outside my window, mapping the streets with the same careful, patient gaze, waiting for me to notice the changes I cannot yet comprehend. I have always loved walking through the city, even on crowded days when people surged along the sidewalks, like rivers of color and noise. There is a certain rhythm to it, a pulse of life that can almost hypnotize you if you slow down enough to notice. That evening, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air humid from a passing rain that had left puddles scattered along the streets. I remember the sound of the wet asphalt under hurried footsteps, the occasional splash of a careless passerby, and the faint hum of neon signs reflecting off the puddles. It was a normal evening, or at least I thought it was. I was crossing a crowded intersection when I saw her. She was standing among the throng, pressed against the blur of strangers, yet I could see her with startling clarity. She was smiling, a small, serene smile that seemed to radiate calm in the chaos around her. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an odd jolt, like electricity skimming along the edges of my skin. I blinked, thinking my tired eyes must be deceiving me. Perhaps she had caught my glance by accident. But no, she smiled again, this time a fraction wider, and my name whispered somewhere in the pit of my mind, as if it were spoken without sound. I looked around, expecting someone else to notice, or perhaps a friend, a passerby. Someone would glance toward her and share the recognition. But no one did. In fact, the crowd flowed around her as though she were a ghost, moving through people without disturbing them, untouched by the rhythm of the street. It was impossible, yet there she was, framed by the golden light of a street lamp, smiling at me with quiet insistence. My chest tightened, and a shiver traced down my spine, not cold, but something deeper, a sense of profound unease. I tried to step closer, to weave through the crowd and reach her. Each time I moved, though, something shifted. The crowd seemed thicker, the noises dimmer, as though the world itself resisted my approach. And yet, she remained, always, just a few feet away, smiling, patient, unwavering. I reached out with my hand, almost instinctively, and for a moment, I thought I might touch her shoulder. But before I could, she tilted her head slightly, and the smile deepened in a way that felt both intimate and impossible. A weight settled in my chest, a strange recognition I couldn't name. Like I had known her all my life but had never met her at all. The lights of nearby stores flickered, the neon reflecting off rain-slicked streets in fractured shards. And I noticed something I hadn't before. Her shadow. It didn't move the way shadows normally do. It didn't respond to the street lamps or the shifting angles of the crowd. It stretched and twisted subtly, always reaching slightly toward me. A silent tether I could not see but could feel. I swallowed hard and looked up at her again. She was still smiling, and still, no one else saw her. Minutes, or was it hours, passed. I kept moving forward, weaving through the crowd, and yet she remained ahead of me, a constant in a world of motion. Every time I tried to call out, my voice faltered, swallowed by the ambient noise of the city. It wasn't that people ignored me, they seemed unaware of my presence entirely, as if I were alone on the street. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, a sharp, insistent rhythm that only made her smile feel more deliberate, more knowing. Eventually, I lost her. One moment she was there, luminous and serene, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving behind only the echo of her presence. I stopped, trembling, drenched by the lingering rain, staring at the faces of strangers who flowed past me without notice. None of them looked unusual. None of them seemed aware that someone had been with me, smiling at me with impossible familiarity. I walked home that night in a daze, the city lights reflecting in puddles like fractured memories. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that her smile lingered somewhere just beyond my sight. In reflective surfaces, in the brief pause between passing pedestrians, I thought I caught glimpses, shapes that weren't quite right, shadows that seemed to mirror my own movements, and always a smile, just at the edge of perception. Even now, months later, when I move through crowds, I sometimes feel it, a faint pull, a sense that she is there, observing, waiting, and I cannot tell whether she is benign, curious, or patient in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend. I do not know her name. I do not know why she is there. But I know this: she is always watching. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can feel her smile leaning over me, quiet, eternal, and impossible. I was walking home that evening, the sky already swallowed by clouds, rain dripping steadily from their gray depths. The streets were slick and reflective, the kind of wet that makes every light bend and fracture, turning the city into a distorted painting. I had left work later than usual, carrying a bag I barely remembered packing, and the day had been long enough to blur the edges of reality. My umbrella did little to keep me dry, but I didn't care. There was a rhythm to the rain, a pulse that matched my exhaustion, and for a moment, I let myself sink into it. The street was mostly empty. A few cars passed, tires hissing through puddles, their headlights creating long, shimmering lines across the wet asphalt. Storefronts glowed with fluorescent warmth behind glass, their interiors neat and meticulously arranged, but deserted. I passed a small corner shop I had never really noticed before, its window slightly fogged from inside, a little golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. For some reason, I slowed. Something about it felt familiar, though I could not place why, and then I saw it. I stopped dead, my heart tightening in my chest. Behind the glass, standing in the very center of the store, was a figure me. My face, my stance, the bag slung over my shoulder, mirrored exactly how I had been walking only seconds ago. The reflection was impossible. It wasn't a reflection. The way the interior lights highlighted the contours of my features, the tilt of my head, it was me, fully there, and yet, not. I swallowed hard, unsure whether to step back or call out, and the figure inside did the same. It raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, pressing it against the glass, as if trying to communicate. I felt a chill that wasn't just from the rain. I leaned closer, peering through the fogged glass, but the further I looked, the more wrong it seemed. The shelves behind the figure were filled with ordinary items, cans, bottles, small household goods, but the arrangement was subtly off. Nothing matched the way such stores usually appear. Items were skewed, labels facing slightly the wrong direction, shadows falling in impossible ways, and my doppelganger moved in ways I didn't, just slightly out of sync, a heartbeat behind. Every gesture I made, I turned to step away, telling myself it must be a trick of the light, fatigue, or the rain blurring my vision. But when I looked back, the figure had advanced closer to the glass. Its eyes met mine, wide and unblinking, and for the first time, I felt what it was like to be truly observed by yourself. There was no mockery, no anger, only an eerie, patient awareness, as if the figure was cataloging my every movement, my every thought. And in that gaze, I felt a deep, inexplicable dread and understanding that I could not intervene, could not warn, could not escape its awareness. I backed away slowly, my shoes splashing in the puddles. My umbrella had forgotten how to protect me. My breaths came unevenly, visible in the cold air, and still the figure followed my movements perfectly, mimicking me with subtle but disconcerting delays. I tried to convince myself it was my reflection, some twisted trick of glass and light. But the angles didn't match. The rain running down the window formed patterns I had never seen, almost like script written in droplets, swirling around the figure inside. I watched, frozen, as the figure lifted its hand again, this time pressing the palm flat against the glass. For a heartbeat, I thought it would simply vanish, but then I felt it on odd pressure, like the glass itself was reaching outward, as though the figure was stretching across the barrier to make contact. I jerked back, heart hammering, and the sound of the rain suddenly felt deafening, filling every empty space in my mind. My own shadow on the sidewalk danced in distorted ways, falling in shapes that made no sense, elongating, twisting, almost as if trying to mimic the figure inside the store. Minutes passed, though I couldn't tell if it was really minutes or seconds. I dared not look away for long. Every time I glanced back, the figure remained patient, still always in the exact center of the room, and yet sometimes it would vanish from my sight, only to appear again in a corner of the store, staring silently, head tilted, waiting. The ordinary world outside the glass seemed to retreat, leaving only the rain, the streetlight, and that impossible presence. Eventually, I forced myself to walk on, the city streets stretching ahead, reflections scattering under every puddle. I dared not glance back too often, but the image haunted me, burned into memory, the way it had mirrored me, the impossibility of its presence, the silent knowledge it carried. I tried to rationalize its exhaustion, hallucination, trick of fogged glass, but logic faltered when I caught a glimpse in a reflective puddle a few blocks away. I thought it was my own reflection, walking beside me, but it wasn't. Its movements were slightly delayed, its head tilting in ways mine did not. I reached home, drenched, shivering, and tried to sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain, but I could still see it, the trapped version of myself. Pressed against the glass, waiting, patient. Shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me, echoing the movements of the store figure. I tried to blink it away, tell myself it was gone, but I knew, in that strange, silent certainty, that it was still out there, in some mirror, some window, some corner I had not yet noticed. Waiting, even now. Months later, when I pass a shop window, a subway station, a glassed-in waiting area, I feel the pull of it. A fleeting, impossible sensation that somewhere inside, myself is trapped, watching me. And sometimes, when the rain falls softly at night, I see it again, not in reflection, but in a presence just beyond the glass. Patient, unblinking, and aware in ways I cannot understand. I am not alone. I have never been alone, and I wonder, sometimes, if the trapped version of me has begun to walk alongside my shadow, silently tracking my every step, waiting for the moment the glass finally dissolves. I have never been particularly observant of bus schedules. The rhythms of my life, work, and errands rarely required more than a glance at the nearest screen or timetable. And yet, that evening, I found myself waiting at the bus stop longer than usual. Rain had started hours earlier, a slow drizzle that became a steady patter, pooling along the asphalt and dripping from the edges of my umbrella. I remember leaning against the shelter, feeling the cool wet metal beneath my hands, the hum of distant traffic blending with the rain, and for a moment, the world seemed nothing more than gray water and faint reflections of streetlights in puddles. The bus stop itself was one of those modern electronic displays, the kind that flicker with arrival times, weather updates, and sometimes local announcements. I watched the numbers scroll, watching the familiar rows of digital text move in there. Usual rhythm, the glowing orange light reflecting off wet pavement. The bus I was waiting for was late, as often happened, and I was tired from the day, tired enough to almost doze, standing there, listening to the rain drum steadily above my umbrella. And then, I saw it. The display, which usually showed something innocuous like next bus, 7 minutes, flashed, stuttered, and then formed words that made my stomach drop. Not arrival times, not advertisements, not even an error message, but a date. A date with my full name next to it. My hands shook as I read it. My date of death. Not a number in the far future, not a vague warning, but precise, near, and absolute. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It had not changed. The display simply continued, pulsing faintly with the rain's reflection. I stepped closer, trying to convince myself it was a glitch, a random sequence of numbers the screen had spat out. But the letters were clear, the date precise, formatted exactly as I have always written, my birthday, day, month, year, my name, my date, staring back at me in cold, unblinking certainty. I leaned closer still, heart thundering in my chest, and the bus stop light reflected across the puddles in fractured orange shards. There was something in those reflections, too, subtle and shifting, a shadow where none should have been, a movement that mirrored mine, but slightly delayed, slightly wrong. I turned, scanning the street for a passerby, anyone who might explain what I was seeing, and the sidewalks were empty. No cars moved, no people hurried past. The rain continued to fall in its endless rhythm, a soft, hypnotic drumbeat that seemed to underscore the impossibility of the display. I spoke aloud, calling my own name, as though the sound could anchor me in reality. The display remained unchanged. My date of death, illuminated in cold orange, as if it were not just information, but a message meant for me alone. Panic rose, low and insidious. I tried to step back, to force myself to see it as a trick of the rain, a reflection in the water, a misinterpretation of tired eyes. But the screen had something more deliberate in its light. The way it pulsed faintly, as if alive, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I remember leaning against the glass of the shelter, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself it was a hallucination. And yet, somewhere deep in my chest, I felt that cold certainty, the undeniable sense that what I saw was not only real, but meant to be seen. The bus eventually arrived, headlights slicing through the wet night, reflections scattering across puddles in fractured light. I got on, shaking, drenched, and sat near the back, watching the digital sign from inside the bus through rain-specked windows. And yet, even there, the display lingered in my mind. Every flicker of light on passing wet asphalt, every shadow cast by the street lamps, carried with it the same impossible weight. My name, my date, an unyielding truth I could not escape. At home, I tried to sleep. I lay in bed, the rain pattering against the window in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, but my mind would not quiet. I replayed the image over and over, the display, the orange digits, the reflection in the puddles, the impossibly still streets. I imagined the shadows that had moved slightly wrong, the sensation of being observed, the sense that something had noticed me noticing it. I could not tell if it had been a warning, a threat, or simply an acknowledgement that I existed in a time and place that was fragile, temporary, and observed. Days passed, but I could not shake it. Every time I approached a bus stop, every digital display flickered in my vision. Numbers, lights, shadows. I began to see them everywhere, half-glimpsed and disjointed, as though the world had begun to communicate in a language I was only beginning to understand. Friends noticed my distant stares, my whispered mutterings about reflections and lights, but I could not explain. How could I? It had been only a date, and yet, the gravity of it, the certainty, had settled in my chest like stone. I stopped taking the bus after that. I walked, avoided displays, avoided technology, as though hiding could make me safe. And yet, in quiet moments, in the rain that taps against my window, I see it again. A flicker in a reflection, a misaligned shadow on the pavement, the sense of being observed from a place I cannot name. And I know, with that same chilling certainty as before, that the date has not changed. It waits, patient and precise, in some way that I cannot yet comprehend. Sometimes, I imagine that the bus stop itself still exists in some shadowed corner of the city, waiting for me to return. I imagine the display flickering, my name glowing orange, and the impossible weight of knowing. And I wonder, in the quiet, if the date is fixed, or if it shifts, patient, until the moment comes when I finally have no choice but to see it again. Even now, when the rain falls softly on the streets, I glance at reflections in puddles, at glints of light on metal and glass, and I can feel it. The quiet, patient certainty of a future that waits for me in plain sight. I cannot explain it. I cannot rationalize it. But I know, in that deep, lingering way, that it is still watching, still waiting, and I have not yet arrived. I've always had a strange relationship with the city at night. There's something about the way shadows pool under streetlights, the way distant traffic hums like a living thing, that makes the air feel heavier, more fragile. That night, the rain had started early, a soft drizzle that became steady, drumming on the pavement and washing everything in muted gray. I had stayed late at work, packing up files and double-checking emails. The office eerily quiet, except for the occasional hiss of the radiator. By the time I stepped outside, my umbrella felt insufficient against the persistent drizzle, but it was the only shield I had. The streets were empty, the usual late-night chatter replaced by the soft rhythm of rain falling on asphalt. I walked slowly, my coat soaked, shoes splashing in shallow puddles, and for a moment, I felt a familiar comfort in the loneliness. That is, until I noticed the old payphone on the corner. Its metal was rusted, the glass cracked in a spider web of fractures, and the handset hung limply, cord frayed and useless. I remember thinking that the phone hadn't worked for years, probably a decade. The city had long since moved on, replacing these relics with mobile towers and touchscreens, and then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, a thin thread of sound that seemed carried more by the rain than the air. I froze, pulling the umbrella tighter, scanning the street. Empty. Nothing moved. And yet, the voice came again, clearer this time, unmistakably calling my name. "It's me," it whispered. My heart stuttered, my breath catching in my throat. I took a cautious step forward, my shoes squishing on the wet sidewalk. The payphone hadn't rung, hadn't lit up, hadn't moved. And yet, there it was, a voice, familiar and impossible, coming from the dead, broken machine. I approached it, each step hesitant, the rain soaking my hair and drenching my sleeves. I lifted the handset, no dial tone, nothing but silence. I pressed it to my ear, straining, and then I heard her. Not just a voice, but the precise timbre of someone I hadn't thought about in years. Someone who had vanished from my life without explanation. She was calling me from a phone that hadn't worked in years, and yet, there she was, clear as if she were standing beside me. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I was hearing. Exhaustion, loneliness, too many late nights. I told myself it must be my imagination. But then the rain seemed to soften, leaving only the voice. She spoke my name again, and I realized I could hear her breathing, the subtle rhythm of it, measured and deliberate. I whispered back, asking questions I didn't expect answers to, and for a moment, I thought I heard her respond. But it wasn't words, I understood, was a series of pauses, small intakes of breath, the shifting of air, a communication that didn't follow the normal patterns of speech. I stepped back from the phone, my hands trembling. The street was still empty, the buildings around me silent except for the patter of rain. But the voice continued, persistent, impossible. I watched the cracked glass, wondering how sound could travel through something so broken, through wires long since severed, and yet it did. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave, to never look back. And still, I stayed, rooted to the spot, mesmerized and terrified. The city seemed to stretch around me in odd ways. Streetlights flickered as though acknowledging the impossibility of what I was experiencing. Shadows pooled where none should have been. and every time I looked away from the phone, I felt the sensation of being watched, the delicate pressure of eyes lingering on me from the darkness. And then, I noticed something else. Faint, wet footprints leading toward the payphone, but they didn't belong to me, and they didn't appear to match any shoes I could imagine. They stopped just short of the machine, leaving a damp, circular impression in the concrete. I remember sitting down on the curb, drenched and shivering, trying to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of fatigue. Yet the voice didn't stop. I could feel it threading through the rain, vibrating through my bones, insistent and intimate. At some point, I realized I could almost anticipate her words, though they never fully formed, only hinted at by intonations and sighs. It was intimate, unnerving, as though someone had found the precise contours of my mind and was tracing them gently, deliberately. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had no meaning in the rain-soaked streets. I don't know when I stopped listening, only that when I finally lifted my gaze, the phone was gone. Not removed, not stolen, just gone. The corner was empty, the concrete dry in spots, as though it had never existed. And yet, I knew the voice had been real. I knew the subtle warmth of recognition, the weight of familiarity, and the impossible sense that someone or something had reached out across years and space to touch me, if only through sound. I never found the payphone again. I asked neighbors, searched the city blocks, revisited that intersection countless times, but it had vanished. And still, sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when rain falls softly against my window and the city hums with distant life, I hear it again. A faint whisper calling my name, from a place I know shouldn't exist, from a phone that no longer works. And I can't tell if it's memory, imagination, or something else entirely, but I know, in a way I cannot explain, that she is still calling. Even now, I sometimes hear the faintest sound, like a phone lifting off its hook in the distance, and I wonder if one day I'll answer again, or if it will answer for me. I never used to think much about being alone. Not really. My days were filled with work, errands, and the hum of the city outside my apartment window. It was only when the rain started that I noticed how quiet the world could get. That evening, the sky had been gray all day, a thick, heavy gray that pressed down on the streets, making them look smaller, almost hollow. I remember walking back from the bookstore, the small bell above the door jingling faintly as I left. The smell of wet asphalt and the faint, earthy scent of rain-soaked leaves clung to me, dampening my coat and hair. The puddles reflected the dim streetlights in fractured patterns, and for some reason, it felt as though the reflections were shifting ever so slightly on their own. I remember thinking it was absurd, that my mind was playing tricks, that the rain was too loud, and my feet too tired, and my thoughts too scattered. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, listening to the soft drip of water from the windowsill. My apartment smelled faintly of old books and the lingering aroma of the tea I'd made hours before. I shrugged off my coat, hung it on the rack, and went to the kitchen. The sound of rain tapping on the glass was soothing, almost hypnotic, and I settled on the sofa with a blanket, my book open but largely ignored as I listened to the storm. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had begun to blur in the steady rhythm of rainfall. I felt an unease creeping in, a sensation I can only describe as a subtle pulling at the edges of my awareness. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an expectation, a tiny twitch of intuition that something was off. My apartment was quiet, except for the rain, yet I thought I heard a faint creak from the hallway. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight, though I knew I had locked the door. I told myself it was the old floorboards settling, that my imagination was reaching for patterns where none existed. I got up to check, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The hallway was empty. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rain still clinging to the building, the faint must of old walls. I shook my head, laughed quietly at myself, and went back to the sofa. The book felt heavier than before, as if the words themselves had grown dense, curling around my mind. That's when I felt it. It started subtly, a light pressure at the back of my hand. I thought I had brushed it against the blanket or the edge of the sofa, but the sensation grew, a warmth, firm and insistent, as though something had curled fingers around mine. I froze, my heart slowing to an uneven rhythm, my mind searching for an explanation. My hand was empty. I lifted it, examined it, and saw only pale skin, nothing more. The pressure had vanished. I blinked and told myself it was a dream, a shadow of exhaustion, a trick of nerves frayed by the rain and solitude. I tried to return to my book, but the words blurred, slipping into incomprehensible shapes. Every so often, I thought I heard a whisper, soft and just beyond comprehension. Not words, exactly, but the cadence of something trying to speak. I sat very still, listening. The rain fell steadily outside, muffling most sounds, but in the gaps between drops, the faintest noises teased my awareness. A soft scrape along the wall, a shadow that didn't quite match the furniture, the hush of breath I was certain was not my own. I moved to the hallway, compelled by some mixture of curiosity and dread. The apartment stretched unusually long, the familiar corners seeming just a bit off. The light flickered, not the bulb, but the reflection of the rain in the windows, and I noticed something in the mirror at the end of the hallway, the shape of a handprint on the glass, pale, smudged, and damp. I approached, my chest tightening, only to find that when I reached the mirror, it was gone. The glass was clean, reflective, ordinary. My pulse thrummed in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was my mind fracturing under loneliness. I told myself to sleep, that tomorrow, the storm gone, everything would be rational again. But when I lay down, the sensation returned. That same pressure at my hand, a firm, impossible grip, like fingers curling around mine beneath the blankets. I held still, eyes wide in the dark, listening to the rain, trying not to breathe too loudly. My heart threatened to betray me with its noise. I whispered my own name, just to hear something human. The night stretched, infinite and unbroken. Occasionally, I felt the grip move, travel slightly up my arm, or brush against my shoulder. Every time I dared to open my eyes, there was nothing, only shadows in corners and the endless silver of rain on the windows. Sometimes, I thought I glimpsed a figure just outside the glass, pale and blurred, melting with the rain's reflection, never entirely solid. And yet, when I blinked, it was gone. Hours slipped into each other. I tried to read, to eat, to call a friend, but each small act was accompanied by the faint but undeniable sensation that I was not alone. Whispers, maybe my own thoughts echoing too clearly, brushed my ears in the quiet. My reflection sometimes lingered too long in the windows, showing not just me but faint distortions at the edges, the shape of another presence that recoiled when noticed. Dawn approached slowly, the rain easing into a fine drizzle. The city outside began to hum with life, though inside, my apartment felt heavier, filled with the memory of the night that wasn't mine entirely. I felt the grip one last time, light and almost gentle, like a reminder, a whisper of something that had been there and would remain even when unseen. I looked around, expecting to catch a glimpse, but saw only the ordinary: the sofa, the book, the pale light of morning washing over walls and floor. I stepped outside that morning, the air fresh, washed clean, yet a small part of me lingered in the apartment. A quiet certainty that, even though I could not see it, it had been there, waiting in the folds of shadows, patient, silent. I never touched that blanket again, never looked at that hallway in the same way. And sometimes, when the rain falls heavily, when the world is muffled and quiet, I swear I feel it again, a faint pressure on my hand. And I know, without opening my eyes, that I am not quite alone. It's been years, and I tell myself it was. Exhaustion, loneliness, imagination. But some nights, as I lie in bed, the rain tapping gently on the window, I feel the memory curl around my fingers, soft and impossibly insistent, and I cannot shake the thought that whatever it was, it never truly left.